Sometimes a journey begins with something so small you almost miss it. For me, it began with a map. Not the kind you buy in a store. This one was folded into quarters, brittle with age, and slipped between the pages of a book that smelled of dust and rain. The book had been sitting in the back corner of Bellamy's secondhand store for longer than I could remember. Bellamy himself never touched it, only dusted around it. He said it gave him a feeling he didn't care for. But that day, as the rain came down in sheets outside, I pulled the book from the shelf. Its cover was blank, the leather cracked and almost gray. When I opened it, nothing but yellowed pages, except for the map tucked halfway through. It was hand-drawn. The lines were shaky, like they'd been made in candlelight. There were no words, no compass rose, no marks of distance, just a small scatter of houses, a bell tower, a thin line of a road leading in and out, and at the very bottom, in faint, fading ink, "Don't stay past midnight." I don't know why I didn't put it back. Maybe it was the way the ink looked like it had been written in a hurry. Maybe it was because the road on the map seemed to lead through a village I knew well, and yet there was no village there, at least not anymore. By the time I reached the counter, Bellamy's hands were already pulling the paper bag closed. He didn't ask why I was buying it. He only said, "If you go looking for it, don't." And then he turned away. The rain had stopped by the time I left the store. The air smelled of wet earth and chimney smoke. I should have gone home. Instead, I found myself walking toward the edge of town, the folded map heavy in my pocket. It was almost evening when the hills began to rise on either side. I unfolded the paper again, holding it up to the dim light. The road I was on matched perfectly with the one on the map. That was when I noticed something strange. The map wasn't static. The lines, thin, trembling, were shifting, as if redrawn every few seconds by an unseen hand. The houses seemed to breathe, growing sharper and then fading again. The ink shimmered faintly. The first house appeared before I expected it. Just a dark shape in the fading light, its roof sloped and uneven. A shutter creaked, the door stood open. And beyond it, the rest of the village waited, silent. I'd walked this valley many times before. It had always been empty, just a scattering of stones and grass, a place where the wind made its home. But tonight, there was a road where there shouldn't be. It was narrow, cobbled, and old, the stones slick with moss. My footsteps made no sound. The houses lined either side, each one different, each one somehow older than the last. Some leaned so far forward it felt like they might collapse into the street. Others stood perfectly straight, their windows black squares staring back at me. I listened for voices, for the scrape of a chair leg, for anything. Nothing. Only the wind. Except, no, not wind. It was breathing. Slow. Steady. The kind of sound a sleeping animal makes when you're too close to its den. I told myself it was my imagination, that the sound was just the air moving through the gaps in the buildings. But the longer I stood there, the more I could feel it. The village itself was breathing. Halfway down the street, I saw a sign swinging above a door. The wood was cracked, the paint long gone, but a single carved image remained, a bell. The map had shown a bell tower at the center of the village. I looked ahead, and there it was, rising above the rooftops, its spire crooked but proud. I felt drawn to it, though I couldn't have said why. As I walked, I noticed the doors. Every single one was ajar, not wide enough to see inside, just enough to suggest that someone had stepped out moments ago. Once I thought I saw movement, a flicker of shadow behind a half-closed curtain, but when I looked again, it was gone. When I reached the bell tower, I found the door hanging open. Inside, the air was cold, colder than the night outside. The floor was littered with papers, each one blank. The stairs wound upward into darkness. Somewhere above, a bell rope swayed gently, though I hadn't heard it ring. On the wall beside the door, carved deep into the wood, were words that made my mouth go dry. Leave before the first chime. I stepped back into the street, my heart pounding. The map had warned me not to stay past midnight, but I had no watch, no clock, no way of knowing the time here. And as I looked up, I realized the sky above the village was different. The moon was wrong. Too large, too close, too pale. Somewhere deep in the village, something moved. The village was not large. From where I stood, near the leaning shadow of the bell tower, I could see almost the entire sweep of it, the crooked main street curling away into darkness, the huddled shapes of houses pressing together as if for warmth. Every door I could see was open, not flung wide in welcome, not kicked in by force, but standing slightly ajar, as if someone had stepped out for only a moment. That, more than anything, unsettled me. An open door meant a recent absence, a life interrupted, and yet I had seen no people. Not a single figure had passed me on the street. The air was heavy with a stillness that wasn't quite silence. It was the kind of stillness that has weight, like a blanket pressed over your ears. The faint sound of my own breathing felt too loud, and somewhere under it all, I heard that same slow, deep inhale and exhale, the breathing of the village itself. I stepped toward the nearest house, its door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. The wood was pale where the paint had long peeled away, revealing grain that felt soft under my fingertips as if the years had eaten it. Pushing gently, I opened the door wider. The hinges groaned, not like metal, but like something alive clearing its throat. Inside, the air was warmer, though not in a comforting way. It was the stale warmth of a place long closed, where the heat is trapped in layers. The scent was faintly sweet, faintly rotted, like fruit left in a bowl too long. A table stood in the center of the room, covered with a white cloth that was no longer white. Faded stains marked its surface, wine, perhaps, or something darker. A single cup sat beside a plate. The plate still held food. Bread, or what had once been bread, now shrunken and blackened with mold. The chair beside it was pushed back, angled slightly toward the door. Whoever had sat there had risen quickly, leaving the meal unfinished. My eyes traveled upward. Hanging from a beam above the table was a length of twine. At first, I thought it was just that, twine. But then I saw the small shapes strung along it. Keys. Dozens of them, each one different, each one tied by its own loop of string. They swayed gently, though there was no draft. I reached for one, a small brass key worn smooth, but before my fingers touched it, something shifted in the far corner of the room. A sound like fabric brushing against wood. I turned. The corner was darker than it should have been, the shadows thicker, layered like folds of cloth. And in that shadow, for the briefest moment, I thought I saw a hand withdraw. My mouth went dry. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding small in the stale air. No answer. Only the faint metallic chime of the keys as they swayed. I backed toward the door, not taking my eyes off the corner. The hand, or whatever it had been, did not appear again. Once outside, I stood for a moment, letting the night air fill my lungs. The street was as I'd left it. Empty. Watching. I moved on to the next house. Its door, too, was ajar. Inside, I found a narrow hallway lined with framed photographs. The glass was cloudy, the images within faded almost to nothing, but here and there a face remained, pale ovals with eyes that seemed to follow me. At the end of the hallway was a bedroom. The bed was made, the blankets smoothed with care. On the pillow lay a hairbrush, and in the bristles, long strands of hair, dark as ink. The window beside the bed was open. Outside, the street looked the same, but when I leaned closer, I realized it wasn't. There was someone standing at the far end, a tall figure, still as stone, facing me directly. I froze. My pulse thudded in my ears. The figure didn't move. I couldn't see details, just the outline against the faint light of the moon. Then, without turning, without taking a step, they were gone. One moment there, the next, the space was empty. I pulled back from the window, my hands trembling. The open door behind me suddenly felt like an invitation I didn't want to accept. I left quickly, stepping into the street again, glancing toward where I'd seen the figure. There was nothing there now. House after house was the same. Open doors, rooms caught in the moment of being lived in, a pot of water still on the stove, cold now, but half full. A child's toy lying in the doorway, its wooden wheels splintered. A book left open on a chair, the print blurred by water stains. No bodies, no signs of struggle. Just absence. The strangest thing was how each house seemed to remember me. As I crossed a threshold, the air shifted, like someone holding their breath. In some, the furniture felt subtly rearranged between the moment I entered and the moment I turned to leave. In others, the shadows seemed to deepen, drawing closer as though listening. At the far end of the street, I came to the largest house in the village. Its door was open wider than the rest, and from within came a faint light. Not firelight, not candlelight, but a pale, cold glow, like moonlight reflected in water. Stepping inside, I found myself in a vast hall. The floor was stone, worn smooth. The walls were lined with shelves, and on each shelf sat a jar. Some were empty. Others held shapes, things I could not name. Some looked like seeds, others like curled scraps of paper, and some looked disturbingly like fragments of bone. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table lay another map. This one was newer, the ink still black, the paper unyellowed. It was the same village, but the houses were fewer. I scanned the page, and my stomach turned. One of the missing houses was the one I had first entered, and in the bottom corner, in the same faint, hurried script, were new words. You are in the map. I stepped back from the table, my breath catching. The jars on the shelves rattled faintly, though no one touched them. The cold glow in the room seemed to intensify, seeping into my skin. Somewhere outside, the bell tower's rope swayed again, and I realized my time here was shortening. As I turned to leave, I heard a voice, soft, almost kind, whisper just behind my ear. Not all doors open out. I spun, but the hall was empty. Only the jars stared back. I stepped into the street again, and for the first time since arriving, I wished desperately for the sound of the wind.
The road narrowed
but the night was
as
too
it
still.
curved toward the northern edge of the village. Here, the houses
watchful.
thinned out, replaced by long stretches of shadow where the cobblestones were cracked and uneven, as if the earth beneath had shifted. The night air grew colder. The moonlight, pale and too close, lit the edges of the roofs, but left the street itself in a gray half-darkness that seemed to cling to me. I hadn't planned to go this way. My steps simply drifted here, as though some quiet current beneath the street was pulling me along. The breathing of the village was softer now, but I could still feel it, subtle like the pulse in your throat when you're very still. And then I saw it. The schoolhouse stood apart from the rest of the village, as though even the other buildings didn't want to be near it. It was small, only one story with a sloping roof and tall, narrow windows. The glass in those windows was clouded, warped with age, reflecting the moon in ripples as though the panes were made of water instead of glass. The door, like every other in the village, was slightly open, but there was something deliberate about its opening, neither welcoming nor careless. It was as if it had been left like that for a reason, a silent invitation I should have known better than to accept. I hesitated at the threshold. The scent of the place reached me before I stepped inside. Chalk dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic. Not blood exactly, more like the smell of an iron key held in your palm too long. Inside, the air was thick. My footsteps didn't echo, but sank into the stillness, like stones into deep water. Rows of desks faced a blackboard that stretched the length of the far wall. The desks were small, meant for children, each one neatly paired with a chair. At first glance, they seemed perfectly ordinary, but as I walked between them, I noticed that every desk was carved with marks, lines, shapes, letters in no language I knew. The carvings weren't random, they were deliberate, layered over years, the grooves polished smooth by countless hands. Some of the shapes seemed to move when I wasn't looking at them directly. I would pass a desk, glance back, and the marks would be different. The blackboard was worse. It was clean, no chalk dust, no faint smudges of erased lessons, but the surface was too deep, too dark, as though it wasn't made of slate at all, but of a material that absorbed light. When I drew closer, I thought I saw faint outlines moving within it, shadows that didn't match my own. On the teacher's desk lay an open book. The pages were blank, except for a single sentence written in the center of one page. Do not answer the roll call. I stared at the words, my skin prickling. My first thought was absurd, that perhaps this was some old village superstition, but then I heard it, a faint voice, muffled by distance, calling names, slowly. At first I thought it was coming from outside, drifting in through the warped glass, but the longer I listened, the more certain I became that it was coming from the blackboard. The names were spoken one by one, each followed by a pause, and though I didn't recognize them, they felt wrong in my ears, too heavy, as if each one carried the weight of its owner's absence. I backed away, but the voice continued. Then I heard it speak my name. The sound of it froze me in place. I hadn't told anyone here my name, No one here could know it, and yet the blackboard spoke it with the same slow care as the others. The silence that followed was different now, expectant, waiting for me to answer. I didn't. The pause stretched longer. The air in the room seemed to press inward, the space between the desks narrowing. Somewhere behind me, a chair scraped against the floor. I turned sharply. The room was empty. The desks and chairs were exactly where they had been, but the marks carved into the nearest desk were fresh now, the wood pale and splintered, as though just cut. They spelled my name. A faint tapping began, first from one desk, then another, as if unseen hands were drumming fingers on the wood. The rhythm was steady, almost like a heartbeat. It grew louder, the sound overlapping until it became a soft roar of tapping all around me. I forced myself toward the door, moving quickly, but not running. Something told me that running here would be like answering the roll call, a mistake that couldn't be undone. Outside, the cold air hit me like water. The tapping stopped instantly, cut off as though it had never been. I looked back at the schoolhouse. The door was closed now. I couldn't remember closing it. The warped glass in the windows no longer reflected the moon. Instead, for the briefest moment, I saw rows of children sitting at their desks, their faces turned toward the door. And at the front, the teacher, a tall, thin figure, stood perfectly still, holding a piece of chalk that left no mark on the board. I turned away and walked back toward the heart of the village, every step echoing in the hollowness of my chest. The breathing of the village was louder again, as though it had been holding itself still while I was inside the schoolhouse. As I reached the corner where the street split into two narrow lanes, I glanced back. The schoolhouse was gone. In its place was an empty patch of cobblestones, no walls, no windows, no roof, just the faint outline of its shadow in the moonlight. And then even the shadow faded away.
The bell tower was impossible to ignore. It rose above every other building in the village, its crooked spire silhouetted against that too large moon, like a finger pointing to something I couldn't see. From almost anywhere in the village, I could glimpse it, between rooftops, at the end of narrow lanes, reflected faintly in the dark windows of abandoned houses. It had been there when I first arrived, quiet and still, but now it seemed to lean, ever so slightly, toward me. I wasn't sure when I decided to go to it. Perhaps it had been decided for me. The street leading there was narrower than I expected. The cobblestones were uneven, slick with moss. The houses here laned closer together, their upper floors almost touching, forming a tunnel of shadow. The air was cooler, and each step seemed to carry me deeper into some place that was not entirely part of the village, though it was at its center. As I drew nearer, I heard the faint hollow sound of a rope swaying, the kind of sound you feel in your bones before you recognize it with your ears. The bell itself had not rung, but the motion of the rope suggested it might. The base of the tower was built from thick, dark stone, the blocks rough and weathered. The door was wooden, bound with rusted iron straps. And like all the other doors here, it was ajar. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning as though the door had been asleep for years. The interior was cold, colder than the night air outside. The walls rose up into darkness, the spiral of the wooden stairs vanishing somewhere above.
The smell here was a mix of old rope, damp stone, and something faintly sweet, like lilies left too long in stagnant water. The only light came from the doorway behind me. It didn't travel far. I stepped inside. The sound changed immediately. My breathing, my heartbeat, the faint shuffle of my shoes against the floorboards. All of it sounded distant, muted, as if wrapped in cloth. The rope hung in the center of the room, thick and frayed, dangling from somewhere above where the darkness pooled. It swayed slightly, though I felt no draft. Carved into the wall beside the rope were words I had already seen once in this village. Leave before the first chime. My fingers brushed the carved letters. The grooves were deep, fresh, as if someone had made them only hours ago. I began to climb. The stairs creaked under my weight, some boards soft enough that I hesitated before putting my full weight on them. Dust floated in the narrow beam of moonlight slipping through a slit window. As I ascended, the breathing of the village faded, replaced by a different sound, something slower, heavier, like the turning of enormous gears somewhere deep within the tower. Every so often, I passed a window. Through them, the village looked wrong. The streets were too straight, the houses arranged in patterns that felt deliberate, almost like symbols. In some windows, I saw movement, figures slipping between doorways, always just out of sight. In others, I saw nothing at all. Not even the moon. Just blackness. At last, I reached the bell chamber. The floor was wooden, worn smooth with time. The great bell hung above me, its surface mottled with patches of verdigris. Its mouth faced downward, silent but expectant. The rope connected to it swayed gently, as though someone below was pulling it. I stepped closer, tilting my head back to see the inside of the bell. My breath caught. Etched along the inner rim, visible only in the pale moonlight, were words. 1 chime for the living, 2 for the lost, 3 for the ones who stay. The air in the chamber shifted. It was subtle at first, a slight stirring, the scent of cold metal sharpening. Then I heard it, a faint, low hum building inside the bell as though it were drawing in breath. I stepped back toward the stairs, my pulse quickening. The hum deepened. The rope twitched. And then, the first chime rang out. It was not loud, not in the way you expect a bell to be. It was deep, almost gentle, but it carried through my body, down to the marrow. I felt it rather than heard it. The sound seemed to reach into the village below, pulling at something invisible. Somewhere outside, a door slammed, then another, and another. I gripped the stair railing ready to descend, but something made me pause. Far below, in the shadows, at the base of the tower, stood a figure. They were looking up at me, though their face was hidden by the darkness. Their hands rested on the rope, but they weren't pulling it. They were just holding it. The hum began again. The second chime rolled through the air, slightly louder, too, though it's still heavy and slow. The moment it rang, the figure at the bottom vanished. I didn't wait for the third. I began to descend, moving as quickly as I dared on the treacherous steps. The hum chased me downward, vibrating through the wood, through my bones. By the time I reached the base, the door to the outside stood open wide, the cold night air spilling in. The village was different now. The houses seemed closer together, their open doors yawning wider, the shadows between them were thicker, and in the spaces where no shadow should have been, I saw faint shapes standing perfectly still. The bell tower loomed behind me, silent once more. But I knew it had not finished.
When I stepped out of the bell tower, the air had changed. It was sharper now, colder, not the damp chill of night, but the dry, brittle cold that comes with winter. I glanced down at the cobblestones and saw that they were no longer bare. Snow. It lay in a thin, uneven layer, as though it had been falling for hours, but never quite settling. It wasn't snowing now. The air was still,
The clouds that should have carried it were nowhere to be seen. I bent down and touched it. It was real. Cold against my fingertips, melting slowly into droplets that clung to my skin. The village looked different under this pale covering. The roofs wore uneven caps of white, the streets traced with faint, crooked lines where the wind had disturbed the powder. The open doors gaped wider now, and some of them seemed to lean into the street, as if listening. Then I noticed the tracks. They began just a few feet from the bell tower door, boot prints, sharp-edged in the snow, leading away down the narrow street. The steps were long, deliberate, each one pressed deep enough to show the outline of the sole. I glanced behind me. There were no tracks where I had come from. None at all. I began to follow them. The sound of my own steps was muffled by the snow, each crunch sinking into the stillness like a whispered word. The prints led me past houses I hadn't noticed before, narrower, taller, their windows sealed shut with boards that looked older than the buildings themselves. Somewhere above, a shutter banged once in the windless air. The tracks didn't wander. They kept a straight path, curving only when the street itself did. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder. The village was too quiet. I half expected to see another set of prints forming behind me, but the snow remained untouched. The further I followed them, the stranger the prints became. At first, they were ordinary boots, but after a while, the impressions began to change, shallower, narrower, as if the person had grown lighter or their feet had shifted shape. In one patch, the marks were so faint they seemed to hover on the surface of the snow without pressing into it. I stopped. Ahead, the tracks led into a small square, the snow there untouched except for a single circle of prints at its center. The circle was perfect, each step placed with unnatural precision. Inside the circle, the snow was completely smooth, undisturbed. I stepped closer, the hair on the back of my neck lifting. As I neared the circle, I felt it, a drop in temperature so sudden it took my breath. The air here was different, thinner, as though something was drawing it away. And then I saw it. In the center of the circle, faint but unmistakable, were more footprints. They were not mine. They were not boot prints. They were bare feet. The toes were long, the arches high, the impressions deep, despite the lack of shoes. And they faced directly toward me. I took a single step back. The prints didn't move. The snow inside the circle remained smooth around them. But in the stillness, I felt something watching me. Not from the houses, not from the street, but from the snow itself. The air seemed to hum, a sound just on the edge of hearing. I thought of the bell tower, of the hum before the chime, and wondered if this was the same note carried here to wait for me. I turned away, intending to retrace my steps, but the path behind me was gone. Where the street had been, there was now only snow, smooth, unbroken. The houses were further away, their shapes blurred by a faint, impossible mist that hadn't been there moments ago. The only tracks left in the snow were the ones I had followed, and the ones in the circle still facing me. I forced myself to move, stepping sideways until I reached the edge of the square. The instant my foot touched the untouched snow beyond, the hum stopped. The world seemed to exhale. When I looked back, the circle was empty. No prints, no disturbance, just snow. But as I stood there, trying to steady my breathing, I noticed something new. A single trail of footprints, boot prints again, emerged from the edge of the square and continued deeper into the village. Only now there were two sets. One was mine, the other was slightly ahead. I didn't want to follow. Every instinct told me to turn away, to find the road that would lead me out. But the village was not built for leaving. The streets curved back into themselves, the alleys narrowed until they were only shadow. Every turn led me deeper, not further away. So I followed. The two trails wound through a part of the village I hadn't seen before. Houses taller than the rest, their windows far above the street, their doors narrow and arched. No light came from within. Somewhere above, faint but clear, came the sound of footsteps. Not mine. They were slow, deliberate, and though they sounded only a short distance away, I never caught sight of the person making them. Sometimes they stopped, as if waiting, and each time I paused, the snow seemed to grow deeper under my feet, clinging to my boots, pulling me down. By the time I reached the end of the street, my breath was visible in pale clouds before me. The tracks led to a door. It was not ajar like the others. It was closed, its wood dark and smooth, the handle gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Carved into the wood were words I had come to dread. Not all doors open out. The door in front of me was different from any I had seen in the village. The wood was dark, polished, and unscarred by weather. It didn't sag on its hinges or gape like a mouth ready to swallow me. It was closed, completely closed, and that alone made it feel more dangerous than all the others left ajar. But it wasn't the door that caught me. It was the light. Through the narrow slit of a window just above the handle, I saw it. A pale glow, steady and cold, spreading across the inside walls. It wasn't candlelight. It wasn't the warm orange of a hearth or the flicker of an oil lamp. It was a color I couldn't name, a strange, bone-pale shade with no warmth at all. It was the kind of light you might see reflected in deep water at night. In this village of shadows and half-darkness, the glow was almost an insult. Something here wanted to be seen. The snow around the doorstep was undisturbed, yet the footprints I had been following led straight to the door and stopped. No turn, no retreat, just a final step facing forward, as if the person had stepped inside and the snow had immediately sealed itself behind them. My breath clouded in front of me as I reached for the handle. It was warm. The door opened without a sound. The glow washed over me instantly, flat and even, without shadows. The air inside was warmer than outside, but it was a still warmth. No movement, no draft. The first thing I saw was the hallway. It stretched straight ahead, impossibly long for a house that looked so narrow from outside. The walls were lined with framed photographs, just like the hallway in one of the houses I had explored before. But these photographs were not faded. They were sharp, clear, and every single one of them was of me. In some, I was standing where I stood now, hand on the door. In others, I was walking the streets of the village. In one, I was bent over the strange map I had found in Bellamy's bookshop. And in the one nearest me, so close, my shoulder almost brushed it, I was sleeping. My skin prickled. I didn't want to see the rest, but my eyes moved anyway. Each photograph showed a different moment, a different place, yet I had no memory of any of them being taken. Some of the angles were impossible, images captured from behind me when I had been alone. I stepped forward, my boots silent on the floorboards. The hallway seemed to lengthen with every step, the far end retreating like a mirage. Halfway down the hallway, I passed an open door on my left. Inside was a small sitting room. A chair was placed facing the window, though the curtains were drawn tight. On the armrest sat a cup of tea, steam still curling from its surface. The chair's cushions were indented as though someone had just been sitting there. I turned away quickly, not wanting to see if the tea was warm. Farther down the hallway, I began to hear it. A faint humming. Not the hum of the bell tower, but something higher, thinner, like a single note being held just beyond my hearing. It was coming from behind a closed door on the right. The light in this part of the hallway was brighter, more insistent, and the photographs here had changed. They no longer showed me. They showed people I didn't know. Faces caught in mid-speech, eyes turned towards something just out of frame. Some of them looked afraid. Some of them looked like they were listening to the same hum I heard now. I stopped at the door. The humming was louder here, pressing against the wood. I knocked once, though I wasn't sure why. The hum stopped. The silence that followed was thick, waiting. I turned the handle slowly. The door opened into a bedroom lit by the same bone-pale glow. The bed was neatly made, and on the pillow lay a folded piece of paper. I stepped closer and unfolded it. The handwriting was the same faint, hurried script I'd seen on the maps. It read, "Do not turn off the light." The hum started again, this time behind me. I turned sharply, but the hallway beyond the door was gone. In its place was another room, identical to the one I stood in. Same bed, same folded paper, same light. I stepped backwards and the paper in my hand vanished. When I looked down, my hands were empty. I didn't know how long I stood there staring at the bed. The hum rose and fell, wrapping itself around the walls. When I finally moved, I found the door was closed again, and there was no handle on my side. I crossed the room and pushed on the opposite wall. It opened into another hallway, not the one I had entered from, but one lined entirely with mirrors. In the first mirror, I saw my reflection exactly as I was. In the second, I was smiling, a slow, unfamiliar smile I knew I wasn't making. In the third, my reflection's eyes were closed, but its lips moved as though whispering something I couldn't hear. At the far end of the mirror hall was another door. It was open, spilling pale light into the snow outside. I stepped through, and just like that, I was back in the street. The house behind me was dark, no glow in a window, no sign of life. But when I looked down, I saw a second set of footprints beside mine, leading away into the night.
The footprints in the snow led me away from the house with the pale light, curling down a narrow side street I didn't remember seeing before. The buildings here were taller, the rooftops uneven, the chimneys leaning, like watchmen peering into the lanes below. The snow was deeper here, soft enough that my boots sank with each step, and the sound of it compressing underfoot was the only noise in the air. I didn't know if I was following the footprints anymore, or if they were leading me. The lane ended in a small courtyard, hemmed in by walls so high they seemed to bend the sky. In the center was a single bench, carved from dark wood and crusted with frost. A figure sat there, hunched forward, elbows on their knees, hands clasped. For a moment, I thought they might be sleeping. But as I stepped closer, they turned their head toward me, slowly, as though the motion hurt. Their face was in shadow, though the moon hung directly above us. When they spoke, their voice was low and flat, carrying no warmth, no hostility, just a simple inevitability. You shouldn't be here. I froze, unsure whether to answer. The figure tilted their heads slightly, as though listening for something far away. Then they said,
You've been hearing it, haven't you? The hum." I didn't reply. They straightened slowly, their movements deliberate, like someone rehearsing motions they hadn't used in a long time. They said, "Everything here has a story, but some stories aren't meant to be told. And some," their voice faltered almost imperceptibly, "some aren't meant to be heard." They gestured toward the far wall of the courtyard, where a narrow archway stood. Beyond it was nothing but blackness. No snow, no light, not even the glimmer of the moon. "That," they said, "is where the village keeps its oldest story. If you listen to it, you will belong to it." The words settled over me like the weight of the snow on the rooftops. A warning? Or perhaps an invitation? I asked, before I could stop myself, "What happens if you walk through?" The figure was silent for a long time. Then they said, "You won't walk back." Something in their tone told me they weren't speaking from theory. They stood, and I saw how tall they were, taller than they had seemed when seated. Their boots left no mark in the snow as they moved toward the archway. They said, "I've told you enough. If you hear it begin, cover your ears and keep them covered until it ends." Then they stepped into the blackness and were gone. The courtyard felt colder without them. The snow seemed to shift under my feet, as though the ground was breathing again. I stood for a long moment, staring at the archway. It felt wrong to turn my back to it, but the idea of walking through was worse. So I retraced my steps, following my own footprints back toward the narrower street. When I emerged onto a wider road, the village felt different again. Some of the doors that had been ajar were now closed. Others stood open wider, and from a few, I thought I heard faint whispers. Not words, just the texture of sound, like pages turning in another room. The hum was back, fainter than before, but it was there. And with it came something else, an urge to find its source. I followed it without thinking, the sound weaving between the houses, drawing me past familiar landmarks I didn't remember passing before. The bell tower, the circle of snow, the house with the photographs. They all blurred into the periphery, as though I were walking through a dream in which the details refused to stay still. Finally, I reached a small door set into the base of a building that looked more like a stone vault than a home. The hum was pouring from within, steady and low. The handle was cold beneath my hand, but the door opened easily. Inside, the light was dim, but not the strange bone-pale glow I had seen before. This was warmer, softer, though it didn't feel comforting. The room was small, its walls lined with shelves. On the shelves were objects, some ordinary, some unrecognizable. A child's shoe, a glass jar half filled with dark water, a clock with no hands. In the center of the table was a single large book. Its cover was blank, but I knew, without being told, that this was the story the figure had warned me about. The hum grew louder as I approached. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cover. The moment I touched it, the room shifted. The shelves seemed farther away, the air thicker, my own heartbeat slower. The book opened on its own. The pages turned rapidly at first, then slowed, until one lay flat before me. The text was in the same hurried, faint handwriting I had seen on the maps. It said, "Now you are hearing it." And I was. It wasn't the hum anymore. It was a voice. Low, patient, and close, though I couldn't tell if it was behind me or inside my head. It began to speak in a language I didn't know, the syllables heavy and drawn out.
I felt them in my bones, in the snow outside, in the walls of the village itself. The longer it went on, the less I understood, not because of the language, but because it began to feel less like words and more like a shape being carved into my thoughts. I slammed the book shut. The voice stopped instantly. The silence that followed was deeper than before, thick enough that I could hear my own pulse. When I turned to leave, the door was gone. The walls of the room curved inward like the inside of a bell. Somewhere far above me, a rope was swaying.
The walls curved around me like the inside of a bell, their stone damp and uneven beneath my fingertips. There was no door, no window, only that faint sway of the rope somewhere far above. The silence was thick, almost liquid, pressing into my ears until I thought I could hear the slow movement of my own blood. Then, without warning, the stone beneath my hand turned cold, colder than the winter air outside. A crack formed in the wall. Not a break, not an opening, but a hairline seam of blackness. It widened just enough for light to spill through, a narrow gray light like dawn seen through fog. When I stepped toward it, the wall gave way entirely, and I was standing at the edge of a courtyard I had never seen before. The snow here was untouched, smooth as glass. In the center stood a well. It was made of the same rough, dark stone as the bell tower, but older. So old that the edges had worn smooth, and the mortar had sunk away, leaving thin gaps between the stones. A wooden roof leaned over it. The shingles warped, the rope that hung down into the darkness frayed and brittle. I walked toward it slowly, my boots sinking into the perfect snow. There were no footprints here, no sign that anyone had come to this place in years. And yet, the rope moved. It wasn't swaying as if in wind, it was twitching. Short and sudden, as though something below was pulling it, testing its weight. I stopped a few steps short. The air above the well was colder than anywhere else in the village, but it wasn't the same winter chill. It was the kind of cold that makes your teeth ache, a cold that feels old and knowing. I leaned forward and peered into the darkness. I couldn't see the bottom, but I could hear something, a faint dripping, slow and deliberate, and beneath it the almost imperceptible sound of breath. Resting on the lip of the well was a small tin cup. It was dented, its surface tarnished, but there was no snow on it. It looked like someone had just set it down. I touched it. It was warm. I set it back and looked again into the well. For just a moment, I thought I saw movement far below, a pale glimmer like a hand catching the faintest light. The rope twitched again. I didn't want to touch it, but something in me, the same part that had made me follow the map here, insisted I should. I wrapped my fingers around the frayed fibers. They were damp, smelling faintly of iron. The instant I did, the rope went still. The dripping stopped, and then, slowly, the rope began to move upward. Hand over hand, something was climbing. I backed away, but the rope kept rising, its frayed ends twisting as though they were being wrung dry. After a moment, I saw it. A pale shape emerging from the darkness. It wasn't a bucket. It wasn't anything I could name at first. It was a mask. White, smooth, with hollow eyes and no mouth. It hung from the end of the rope, swaying gently,
The frayed fibers looped through a hole where the mouth should have been. I stared at it, the snow silent around me. The mask turned slightly, as though it were listening. Then, from deep in the well, a voice spoke. It wasn't loud, but the sound carried through the air like a thread pulled taut. "You can put it on," it said. The words were calm, almost kind. I didn't answer. The rope twitched again, and the mask swayed closer to me. "You'll need it to leave." The last word echoed, though I wasn't sure if it was in my ears or my head. I stepped back. The mask hung there for a moment longer, then slowly descended back into the darkness, the rope unspooling until it vanished below. The breath from the depths grew louder for a few seconds, then faded. The dripping began again, slow and steady. I turned to leave and found that the snow behind me was no longer smooth. Footprints. A single trail leading away from the well. They weren't mine. I followed them. They led to a narrow path between two high walls of stone. The snow here was deeper, the air heavier. The path curved sharply, and when I reached the bend, I saw it. The bell tower. Closer than it should have been, as if the village had shifted around me. The rope inside was swaying, and in the shadow of the doorway stood the same figure I had seen from the top of the stairs earlier, watching me.
The figure in the bell tower doorway didn't move. They stood with one hand resting lightly on the frame, the other hanging at their side. The stillness of their posture so complete, it felt unnatural. I wanted to speak, to call out, to demand answers, or at least the simplest one. Why am I here? But the village had taught me something. Questions didn't survive here. They came apart in the air, scattered like snowflakes before they ever reached another ear. The figure stepped back into the shadows of the tower. I hesitated at the edge of the courtyard, my boots half buried in the snow, watching as the darkness swallowed them. Then, without any conscious decision, I began to follow. Inside, the air was colder than it had been the first time I entered. The rope in the center swayed lazily, brushing against the stone wall with a sound like fabric sliding over skin. The spiral staircase rose into the dark above, but the figure wasn't climbing. They were standing at the base, beside the rope. Their face was still hidden, but their voice was clear when they finally spoke. "It's almost time." I wanted to ask time for what, but the words stuck in my throat. They nodded once toward the rope. "You can go back," they said, "if you leave before the third." "The third what?" I managed to ask. They didn't answer. Instead, they began to climb the stairs, slowly, as if every step was deliberate, counted. I followed, my hands grazing the cold wall, my ears straining for any sound beyond the creak of the steps. Halfway up, I heard it, the hum. It was deeper now, fuller, as though the wood of the stairs, the stone of the tower, and the air itself were vibrating in unison. When we reached the bell chamber, the moon was directly overhead, its light spilling through the narrow windows in thin silver lines. The figure stood beside the bell, one hand resting on the rope. They looked at me for a long moment, though I still couldn't see their eyes, before speaking. "You've walked the streets, you've seen the doors, you've heard the story. Now you decide." The hum swelled, the rope shifted in their hand. Then came the first chime. It rolled through the air like a wave, sinking into my chest, into the boards beneath my feet. Somewhere below, I heard the sound of doors closing in unison. The figure didn't move. The second chime followed, slightly louder, sharper. The air seemed to thin, the light from the moon stretching, bending, as if drawn toward the bell. From the windows, I could see the village shifting, the streets narrowing, the houses tilting inward, the spaces between them filling with shadow. The figure's voice cut through the hum. "Leave now, and you will carry it with you. Stay, and you will belong to it." The rope tightened in their grip. The third chime began, not quick, not sudden, but slowly, as if the bell was drawing in every last breath before releasing it. I turned toward the stairs, but at the top step, I stopped, because I saw them, people, or what was left of them, standing in the shadows below. Dozens of figures, each one still, each one watching. Some had faces, some didn't. Some I recognized from the photographs in the house, some I didn't recognize at all. The third chime rang. It was not loud. It didn't need to be. It carried something heavier than sound, something final. The figures below didn't move, but the space between them seemed to stretch, inviting me in. When I finally stepped down into the base of the tower, the figure was gone. The rope hung still, the hum had faded. I walked out into the street, and the snow was untouched, perfect. No footprints, no signs of my path. The doors of the houses were all closed now. The windows reflected only the moon. I wandered for what felt like hours, but the streets no longer led anywhere. Every turn brought me back to the same place: the well, the courtyard, the bench, and then finally, the bell tower. It stood in the center of the village, silent and still, waiting. Somewhere in the distance, a door opened. The sound was small, almost gentle. I turned toward it and saw a figure standing in the doorway, their hand resting lightly on the frame. They didn't move. I stepped toward them. I don't remember what happened next, only that I woke up somewhere else, standing on a road I knew, the village far behind me, the folded map heavy in my pocket. The ink was still shifting, but now there was something new at the bottom, written in that same faint, hurried hand. "You left before the third," and below it, in smaller letters, "Not everyone does."